The autumn wind swept down from the Pyrenees, curling through the narrow stone streets of San Evaristo, a forgotten village nestled in the shadows of northern Spain. It stirred the red and gold leaves like whispered secrets, carrying with it the scent of damp earth and wood smoke. It was a place of crumbling chapels and shuttered windows, where the past lingered like fog and names were spoken with caution. And it was here, beneath a slate-gray sky that threatened rain, that Isabela Vargas arrived with blistered feet, a jar of quince paste tucked in her satchel, and ash still clinging to the hem of her dress from the fire that had devoured her family's bakery. She stood before the manor gates, dwarfed by iron and stone, heart thundering beneath her threadbare shawl. The villagers had warned her not to come. El Castillo del Silencio, they called it, the Castle of Silence. And its master, Count Rafael de León, hadn't opened his doors to the world in nearly 10 years. Rumors tangled around his name like ivy: madness, murder, heartbreak, curses. Some said he lived alone with ghosts. Others claimed he'd gone blind from grief. But no one really knew. Isabela knocked anyway. Not because she was fearless, but because she had nothing left to lose. The door creaked open slower than her breath. She expected a butler, perhaps, or a stone-faced housekeeper. But it was he who stood there. Rafael de León. He was taller than she'd imagined, thinner too, not frail, but carved down by time and solitude. His hair, once black as ink in the faded portraits she'd seen, now bore streaks of silver that caught the stormlight. His eyes were a shade of green that did not seem to belong to this century, burdened with knowledge no one asked for. He studied her like a puzzle. "You cook?" he asked. She opened her mouth, found no voice, and nodded. He stepped aside without a word more. The inside of the manor was hushed, as if sound itself had learned to tread softly. Dust floated in shafts of pale light that pierced the tall windows. Chandeliers hung like forgotten crowns above marble floors. She followed him through endless corridors, past locked doors and curtained portraits, until they reached the kitchen, a grand, ancient thing with a stone hearth and iron stoves older than her grandmother. He pointed to the pantry. "Cook. No meat. No strong onions. And no one enters the east wing." He left without a backward glance. And so began her days within the walls of the silent castle. Each morning, she rose before the sun and let her hands find comfort in the work. Dough beneath her palms, herbs crackling under the blade, fire warming her face, it all made her feel human again. She filled the rooms with smells of rosemary stew, fresh bread, quince tart, and spiced wine. But the meals vanished before she could see them eaten. Plates left outside doors, always returned spotless. She was alone in her labor. Alone in her thoughts. But not unobserved. She felt him watching. From behind curtains, across dimly lit halls, from the balcony above the courtyard. Never speaking. Never intruding. Just a silent presence in the air around her. It should have unnerved her. Instead, it became a strange comfort. Once, as she scrubbed the long oak table, she found a lily resting in a copper bowl. No vase. No note. Just the flower, fresh and pale, placed where he knew she'd see it. Her heart beat oddly in her chest that day. Then came the storm. Thunder rolled down from the mountains like a siege. Rain battered the leaded glass windows. The fire in the kitchen guttered low, and she huddled close to it, rubbing warmth into her wrists. That's when she heard the door open behind her. She turned, startled. He stood in the doorway, the glow of the hearth painting shadows across his face. He looked as if he hadn't slept in days. "You hum when you stir the stew," he said quietly. "My mother did that. I'd forgotten." She blinked. "Forgive me, my lord. Don't call me that. My title died with the monarchy. Call me Rafael." He crossed the room and, without invitation or pause, poured her a glass of wine. Then, he sat across from her, not as a nobleman, but as something lonelier. "What do you dream of when you're alone?" he asked. The question hit like wine through a broken window. She looked at him, really looked. There was a crack beneath his mask, something fragile beneath the stillness. Her tongue dried. She wanted to lie. Instead, she said, "A kitchen. My own. Small, but full. Warm light. Maybe a bell on the door." He smiled faintly, as if it hurt to move his lips. That's not a dream. That's a life. Not mine, she whispered. He studied her, then drank. The fire danced between them. The next day, a silver coin sat atop the breadboard. Clean, polished, out of place. She left it there. The day after that, a chessboard appeared in the library, pieces arranged mid-game. She moved one, just one. By morning, another piece had been moved in reply. And thus began a quiet courtship of stolen glances and wordless gestures. He never touched her. Not her hand. Not her cheek. But his absence became unbearable when it lasted more than a day. One evening, as she laid herbs across a roast, she heard his voice behind her. You never ask me why. Why what? Why I let you stay. Why I watch. She didn't turn. Because you're lonely. But too proud to admit it. A pause. Maybe. She faced him then. Why me? His eyes burned. Because you don't flinch. You don't try to fix what's broken. You just live. Silence hummed around them. He reached out. Not to touch, but to offer. A folded note. She opened it. Asterisk tonight. The West Garden. After moonrise, asterisk. She went. Of course, she went. The garden was overgrown, wild with vines and forgotten statues. But in the center stood a fountain, long dry, now lit by lanterns he'd hung himself. He waited beside it, hands behind his back, hair tied back in a ribbon that had seen better years. You found me, he said. You called me. He took a step forward. There's no one left to tell me what I can or cannot do. No court. No crown. Just walls. And you. She said nothing. He stepped closer. I want you to stay. But not as a servant. Not as someone I watch from a distance. Her breath caught. Then what? She whispered. He leaned in, close enough for her to smell cloves on his breath. As someone I wake to. As someone I dance with in this dying house. As someone who makes this place alive again. She trembled. And still, he did not touch her. I'm not noble, she said. I'm not. You are everything, he interrupted, voice low, trembling now too. And in that moment, she saw him, not the count, not the ghost, not the recluse, but the man. So she closed the space between them. And kissed him. Not softly. But like someone who had nothing to lose, and everything to remember. She hesitated at first, but something in his voice, low, uncertain, unlocked her. Perhaps it was the storm muttering outside, or the flicker of candlelight softening his sharp features. Perhaps it was the way he leaned forward, not like a count, but like a man hoping not to be left alone again. So she spoke. Quietly at first. Words stumbling like fawns on frostbitten legs. She told him of mornings in her mother's bakery, of cinnamon rising in the air and flour clinging to her lashes. Of her dream to one day have her own corner in the plaza, with shelves of jam jars, braided loaves, and children pressing their noses to the glass. She described the color of her father's silence, the gray of unfinished walls and burnt crusts, and the way her mother had sung over every broken thing like it was a hymn worth saving. Rafael said nothing. He didn't move. But his knuckles were white from how tightly he clasped his hands. After that night, the rhythm of the manor changed. He no longer watched from behind curtains. He came into the kitchen now, sometimes unannounced, sometimes only to ask if she'd ever tried basil in lemon broth. He let her see the library. A room untouched by dust, with spines worn by his hands and margins filled with notes. He never asked what she thought of the stories. But she'd find certain books moved beside her breakfast plate, a passage marked, a silent invitation. Their silences grew comfortable, like blankets wrapped around chilled skin. She'd glance up from kneading and find him carving wood near the window. He began carving her face, he didn't say it, but she knew. The eyes were hers. The mouth shaped in thought. It scared her. He taught her chess using old silver coins instead of pieces. She made him help in the kitchen, he was terrible at measuring, brilliant at seasoning. Once, she laughed at the way he sneezed flour across the counter. He looked at her like he had heard music for the first time in a decade and dropped a fork in surprise. But every joy she tasted was laced with a question. Why had he vanished from the world? Why the haunted look when the wind howled? Why did he speak of trust like a wound? The answer came on a night when winter stole the last color from the trees. He had left his coat draped over the edge of a chair. She moved it aside to wipe down the table, and a folded parchment slipped to the floor. A broken seal. Royal. She didn't mean to open it. But her hands acted without her. It was a letter from the Palace of Aragon. A letter that spoke of an engagement, Count Rafael de León to Princess Maria of Albaluna. The language was formal, the promises grand. Her breath snagged on the dates. 10 years ago. He found her in the corridor, standing still, letter trembling in her fingers. You shouldn't have read that, he said. I know. He took the parchment from her, folded it precisely, and slid it back into his coat pocket. I was meant to marry her, he said, eyes on the candle between them. It would have restored my family's fortune. Their favor. My father was desperate. She was, agreeable. Isabela didn't move. 2 nights before the wedding, he continued, I walked into her chamber to speak of music for the ceremony. Instead, I found her, not alone. My brother. My only brother. He gave a bitter laugh, short and empty. The guard said I struck him. I don't remember. I ran. I renounced the court. My name. I buried everything in these walls. She wanted to touch his hand. But she didn't. She feared the strength of what lived between them. And the cost of it. That night, she didn't sleep. Her thoughts were full of silver coins and green eyes and mouths that never finished what they started. The next morning, a knock came at her door. A servant she barely knew handed her a box. Inside, wrapped in tissue that smelled faintly of cedar, was a gown. Not velvet. Not gold-stitched. But silk, smooth as poured cream and the color of the Cordoban sky at dawn. She held it to her chest like it might vanish. He wishes you to dine with him, the servant said, then paused. In the great hall. The great hall. The words felt unreal. No one had seen it open since the last time court had gathered there, since the world had still expected Rafael to rule, to marry, to play his part. Isabela had only glimpsed its carved doors once, and even then they'd seemed more like tombstones than entryways. Now she stood before them, heart hammering, hands pressed to her stomach as if to quiet it. She had braided her hair. Washed with rose water. Her shoes clicked faintly on the marble floor. When the doors opened, she stepped into another world. Candles floated like stars in golden sconces. A fire blazed at the far end, breathing warmth into every stone. A table long enough to seat 30 was laid for 2. And at its head, he stood. Not the disheveled man of wood shavings and sorrow. But Rafael de León, dressed in midnight black with a silver pin at his collar, his posture regal, his expression unreadable. She hesitated. He offered a single nod. It was enough. They dined in silence at first. The food was hers, his favorites. He ate now, in front of her, without shame. She watched his fingers, the way he savored, the way he closed his eyes with each sip of wine. He looked more alive than ever. When the final plate was cleared, he rose. She thought it was over. She reached for her shawl. But he extended his hand. Dance with me, he said. There's no music, she replied. There doesn't need to be. She hesitated, then gave him her hand. They moved slowly across the polished floor, her steps clumsy at first, then steadying. The room echoed with memory, not sound. He guided her with care, as if each motion stitched something back together. She didn't speak. Didn't ask what it meant. She simply let the warmth of his touch soak through the silk. Let the scent of pine and wine wrap around her like a promise. And when he pulled her just a little closer, when his lips hovered near her temple, she let her eyes close. Not in surrender. But in something far more dangerous. Hope. The doors creaked open like an ancient breath, slow and solemn. Dust rose into the candlelight in swirling ribbons, and for a long moment, Isabela hesitated at the threshold of the great hall, unsure whether she had stepped into a dream or a memory not her own. The space was cavernous, haunted by time. Cobwebs clung to the carved arches overhead. Faded heraldic banners drooped from the rafters. The air was perfumed with wax and pine smoke and something older, perhaps grief. She took a step forward. Her slippers barely whispered across the marble floor, but her heart pounded loud enough to echo. The gown he had chosen for her wrapped her body in silk, the color of moonlight on snow, the fabric scandalously soft, scandalously fitted. She felt it cling to her hips with every breath, as if it too had never been invited into such opulence. At the end of the hall, near the hearth blazing with fresh logs, he waited. Not in uniform. Not in velvet or medals or crowns. But in a simple dark suit, tailored and worn, with his hair combed back and a glint of steel at his cuff. Rafael de León, once heir to noble blood, now stood not as a count but as a man, bare, exposed, and waiting only for her. She could not tell if her body moved of its own accord, or if some invisible thread bound her to him. But somehow, she was beside him, his hand outstretched, his voice a low murmur that trembled like the firelight. "You came. You asked." He smiled, just barely. "Then let us eat, before my courage fails me." The table had been set for two. Gold-trimmed plates. Crystal goblets. Silver cutlery aged to dull elegance. She wondered if these were the same utensils used at the last royal dinner held in this hall, before scandal and exile had silenced it. The food had been made by hands other than hers, perhaps he had trusted another servant just this once, but it was perfect. Roasted duck glazed with orange and wine. Saffron rice flecked with almonds. Figs softened in honey. She ate in silence, aware of every movement, every glance he stole when he thought her eyes lowered. At one point, he reached across the table, brushed a crumb from her lower lip. She didn't breathe for a full heartbeat. From somewhere above them, the sound of a violin drifted down like smoke. A melody slow and aching, the notes trembling with sorrow. She tilted her head toward the gallery, but saw no musician. "An old friend," he said. "One who plays for ghosts." The music continued, sad and searching. She looked back at him. He had risen from his seat. "Will you dance?" he asked. Her throat tightened. "Here. No one will see." His smile was soft, broken. "Only the ghosts." She stood, hesitant, and placed her hand in his. He pulled her gently into the open space between the hearth and the table. The violin swelled. His hand found the small of her back, and hers curled instinctively against his shoulder. They began to move, slowly at first, like strangers trying to find a rhythm neither remembered. His breath touched her cheek as they turned. Her fingers trembled. "You don't belong in the kitchens," he whispered. "I don't belong in ballrooms either. You belong with me." The words fell like warm rain on parched ground. She could not reply, not in words. Her eyes lifted to his, and he saw all the things she could not speak, the hunger, the fear, the quiet ache that had grown louder each day in his presence. When the music faded, they did not part. He took her hand, and without a word, led her from the hall, through the echoing corridors, past the hushed portraits of ancestors whose eyes no longer judged. They stepped into the night. The sky above them was wide and torn open with stars, a celestial wound too bright to ignore. The air was cold, sharp, but she didn't feel it. He guided her through the side gate into the overgrown gardens, where stone paths vanished beneath moss and broken fountains wept with ivy. They stopped at the marble basin at the heart of the garden, the one where lilies once bloomed in spring. Now dry, forgotten. But the moonlight made it silver. She turned to him. There were no words between them anymore. Only breath. Only proximity. He touched her face, barely, and she leaned into it. His thumb brushed the curve of her cheekbone, his gaze not of desire, but of something deeper. Something reverent. And then he kissed her. Not hesitantly. Not shyly. But with the aching certainty of a man who had spent too long waiting for the moment to be allowed. Her body melted into his. Her hands clutched the lapels of his coat as if to anchor herself. His arms encircled her waist, pulling her close. They kissed beneath the fractured starlight like the world had narrowed to this garden, this hour, this breath. When they pulled apart, neither of them spoke. They didn't need to. They returned to the manor hand in hand, walking slowly, like people afraid to wake from a beautiful dream. At the door, he brushed his lips to her forehead. "Good night," he whispered, but it sounded like a promise. She watched him disappear into shadow. She went to her chamber, still trembling. But when she pushed open the door, her breath caught in her throat. Her satchel was on the bed. Her boots by the hearth. Her scarf folded. And on the kitchen table, beneath the flickering candle, a note awaited her. She stepped closer, heart already breaking before her eyes read the words. Asterisk, you must leave by sunrise. Do not ask why. R asterisk. The room blurred. She clutched the paper in shaking hands, reading it again and again, hoping it would change. But it did not. The warmth from the garden was already fading from her skin. The stars outside still burned. But inside her, something was already turning to ash. The sky had barely begun to blush with morning light when the carriage wheels cracked against the frozen earth outside El Castillo del Silencio. No fanfare. No servant. No voice calling her name. Just the waiting shape of exile, cloaked in frost and finality. Isabela stood at the top of the stone steps, a threadbare shawl draped around her shoulders, her hands raw with cold. The cook's dress had been returned to her quarters sometime in the night, folded with cruel precision atop her trunk. The silk gown, blue as Cordoban skies, had vanished as if it never existed. He did not come. She waited. 1 minute. Then 5. Then 10. No footsteps echoed through the corridors. No creak of the upper landing. No apology. No reason. The windows of the east wing remained shuttered, as if even the house had turned its back on her. With trembling fingers, she gathered the few belongings she'd once carried through the gates of this manor, her jar of quince paste now cracked at the rim, a wooden spoon, a strip of lavender cloth that had lined her mother's old baking tin. Things unworthy of memory. She climbed into the carriage with the silence of someone sleepwalking. The driver said nothing. His eyes did not meet hers. The gates closed behind them with a groan that sounded like mourning. San Evaristo greeted her not as a daughter returned, but as a rumor come to rest. Faces turned away. Doors shut quietly. Even the baker's wife who had once given her coins for sugared figs offered only a shrug and a whisper. She walked the square with her head lowered, the scent of horse dung and salt fish thick in her lungs, and when her knees finally gave out beneath her, she collapsed beside the well, face pressed to the frozen stones, shoulders trembling not from cold but from the wound no one could see. She did not ask aloud, but the question bled from her in every heartbeat. Why? There were no answers. Only the echo of villagers muttering, "Foolish girl. Cook or countess, it makes no difference. He was never meant for you." She might have disappeared then. Might have folded herself into silence like so many other forgotten women, bruised by the dreams they dared to touch. But survival was stitched into her bones. She moved on. 3 days later, she boarded a cart bound for a neighboring town, where the air was thinner and the bread was bitter but the coins still bought warmth. She found work in a bakery tucked between a tannery and a weaver's stall. The owner was old and half-blind but generous with bread ends and short on questions. She slept on sacks of flour in the storeroom, her hands red with burns, her skin dusted in crust and memory. She spoke little. Laughed never. But every loaf she shaped bore his name. She didn't say it. She didn't write it. But it lived in the soft bend of the crust, in the cinnamon swirl she added when no one was watching, in the precise way she folded the corners of dough. Rafael. Always Rafael. Nights were worse. In the darkness behind the ovens, she would sometimes wake gasping, her hands reaching for a coat no longer hers, a hand she could no longer hold. She told herself she hated him. That she had imagined the softness in his eyes, the truth in his touch. That it had all been a lie, a game, a nobleman's indulgence. But truth has a cruel way of breathing beneath denial. One morning, as winter curled its claws deeper into the village, she opened the shop's side door to toss the day's ash, and there he was, not Rafael, but a man cloaked in brown wool, his boots thick with travel, his face drawn tight against the wind. He said her name once. Just once. She stared at him. The scar across his hand caught the weak morning light. He looked like a man who had not known rest for weeks. Without a word, he reached into his coat and handed her a letter. The seal was unbroken, wax dark as blood. She took it with hands that barely functioned, then watched as he mounted his horse and vanished into the snowy alley. Inside, she stood motionless by the hearth. The bakery groaned with rising dough, but the rest of the world held its breath. She broke the seal. The ink was rushed. A smudge at the corner. The handwriting unmistakably his. Come back. I was a coward. I told myself I was protecting you. That pushing you away would spare you the weight of my ruin. But I see now, all I did was tear open a wound in both of us, wide enough to drown. You are the only light this house has known since my mother's laughter faded. The only warmth the halls remember. I cannot breathe in the silence anymore. I will not ask for forgiveness. Only for a chance. You're coming. Her knees gave way once more, but this time, she did not fall from despair. This time, she pressed the letter to her chest, and let the warmth rise up behind her ribs like the first sun after a long, bitter season. The carriage wheels turned slower this time, as if even the horses sensed the weight of the moment. Snow melted on the stones of San Evaristo, turning the roads to silver threads beneath the morning light. When Isabela leaned out the window, the manor appeared through the thinning fog, El Castillo del Silencio, cloaked not in shadows, but in light. The ivy still curled up its walls, clinging like memory. But candles now flickered in every window, their golden glow softening the cold gray of stone. Life had returned. Or perhaps, love had. She stepped down without assistance. The doors opened before she could knock. Inside, the hush was different now, not the heavy stillness of sorrow, but the quiet before something sacred. The servants bowed as she passed, heads lowered not in duty, but in reverence. No more disdain in their glances. No veiled murmurs behind her back. Only warmth. Recognition. One of them, a girl no older than 16, pressed a hand to her chest and whispered, "Welcome home." Isabela's breath caught. She climbed the stairs slowly, each step echoing with the past. The night he kissed her. The morning he cast her out. The months her heart broke in silence. And now, this. At the landing, beneath the stained glass window that poured jeweled light across the marble floor, he waited. Rafael. He was changed. No longer unshaven, hollow-eyed, wrapped in self-imposed exile. He wore a dark suit tailored to his frame, the embroidered sigil of his family stitched at the collar. His boots polished, his stance proud, but not cold. His hair was tied neatly, the silver at his temples like frost caught in morning sun. But his eyes, they had not changed. Green, intense, and wholly hers. She stopped before him. "You left me," she said. Her voice did not shake. He didn't flinch. "I feared I would ruin you," he answered. "You did." His mouth pressed into a line. "I know." The silence stretched between them, vast and fragile. "Say it," she whispered. "Say why you brought me back." He took one step forward. Then another. His hands found hers, and he held them not like porcelain, but like something sacred. His thumbs brushed her knuckles, slow and trembling. "Because you stole my heart," he said, voice thick. "You did it quietly. Without asking. You crept into my halls, into my days, and into my chest until I could no longer breathe without tasting you. And now he exhaled. Now I want the world to hear it." She blinked, the weight of his words threading through every breath. And then, without fanfare, the chapel doors behind him opened. She had never stepped foot inside before. The room was smaller than the great hall, but warmer. Sunlight poured through tall glass panes, bathing the pews in gold and dust. Flowers, fresh from the winter gardens, lined the altar, simple, fragrant. White lilies and rosemary. No choir waited. No dignitaries. Only him. And her. He led her in gently, their footsteps soundless on the stone. The air held the faint scent of pine and beeswax. A priest stood beside the altar. He nodded with quiet approval. Not the nod one gives to royalty. The nod one gives to truth. They faced each other. No rings exchanged. No guests watching. Only vows. "I do not promise riches," Rafael said. I do not promise to shelter you from sorrow. But I promise that every breath I draw will be drawn with you in mind. That every morning I wake, I will remember the woman who reminded me what it meant to feel. Isabela, tears thick in her eyes, touched his chest over his heart. I have nothing but bread and scars, she said. But they are yours now. If you'll have them. If you'll have me. I do, he breathed. And I do. The priest said words neither of them remembered afterward. But when Rafael kissed her, it was not the first time. It was the first time in front of God. The halls of El Castillo del Silencio knew joy again. In the kitchens, her hand shaped loaves that warmed every table. Servants began laughing in the corridors. Music returned, sometimes just a violin in the gallery, sometimes Rafael humming off-key behind her as she stirred a pot. Guests came once more. Nobles curious. Peasants welcomed. And everyone who passed through the gates left whispering her name like a secret charm. She was no longer just a cook. She was the woman who brought the Count back from silence. And in the evenings, when the stars spilled across the sky and the frost whispered at the windows, Rafael would pull her close before the fire, press his lips to her temple, and say only one thing. You're coming with me. Always. And she did. Always.